What's up, gangsters? How about 10 minutes of random? Or, I mean, let's be realistic. It's going to be more like 15 or 20, right? Anyway, the first random thing is not something I'm going to show you at my bench because it's actually more of an announcement. And that is that, like everybody, I am doing a Patreon page now. But what I hope is that mine will be a little bit different because it is going to be very specifically focused on one single thing, and that's going to be an open Q&A session, live stream. That's right. Apparently now with Crowdcast, an app that does live streaming stuff, kind of like Zoom, etc., Patreon has made it possible to have live stream events that are exclusive only to your patrons. And this is something that I've thought about doing for a long time, but just didn't know the technology. So I'm pretty excited about this. Basically, what I'm going to do is every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, for an hour or a little more if need be, I'm going to do open Q&A. Basically, it's going to be an Ask Me Anything with regard to modeling. So, you know, there will be no such thing as a dumb question. Doesn't matter, you're beginner, expert, whatever. If it's about model making, let's talk about it. And we will cover, you know, I'll do my best to come up with good answers right then. If I don't, I'll go off and do my homework and we'll catch it the next time around. Now, one Saturday a month, however, is going to be focused specifically on Fusion 360. If you're not familiar with that, that's a 3D CAD package produced by Autodesk that a lot of people are using for creating parts to have 3D printed. And the great thing about Fusion 360 is that it's pretty much as functional as just about any real CAD package. And by real, I mean real expensive. Fusion 360 has a free license for hobbyists, so that lets you play for no money. Even if you have to pay for it, it's like only $500, which, believe me, in the CAD world is cheap. Anyway, point being is that I have a lot of CAD experience in my background going back 25 years, and I, have been turning that to scale modeling over the last couple of years to build my own parts for my own projects, and even doing some commissioned projects for people who need stuff designed. I'm actually working on a model kit right now that I'm designing for a company that produces short-run resin kits. So I feel like I'm capable of doing a decent job of instructing people on how to use Fusion 360. And if there's more demand for it, we'll do more than one Saturday a month. But I've got the capability to screen share on the live stream. So I can do demos, you can send me files, we can work on specific problems right there on screen. The cool thing is that it's only $10 a month to be a patron. There's only one tier level, and the $10 a month gets you access to all of the Saturday sessions, even if you don't come, because you can have access to the recordings. Each session is automatically recorded and saved on Crowdcast, so it makes it pretty easy. We've had 2 sessions so far. They've gone really well. It's been a lot of fun, and I think it's going to be cool. But it is still experimental. I am still figuring some things out. We had pretty bad echo with the last one, but we are getting things figured out, and I think it's going to be a neat thing going forward. So if it's the kind of thing that interests you, check out my Patreon page. It's just under Will Pattison, and sign up. Come on over. Bring your questions. All right, let's get on to the rest of the random. Okay, so I did finally get back to my P40 Warhawk project, and pretty much all the time that I've spent since the last one of these episodes has been all about bodywork. I got the fuselage halves joined, obviously, and that has meant a bunch of rescribing, sanding, filling, etc. Not that there were really any gaps, because the fuselage halves fit together perfectly, but still can't have any sort of a joint there across the top of the tail or the bottom of the tail. So I had to deal with those, and that's all been pretty straightforward. What has not been nearly as straightforward or at least not as simple, is all of this work around the nose. It's been a grind, and the reason is because not because the fit of these parts is bad. I mean, it's actually that it's almost too good. If you're not familiar with this 1/32 Hasegawa Warhawk, you may not know that. Let's see. There's a bunch of individual pieces on the nose here that allow them to produce different versions of the aircraft. Okay. So this whole thing here is the cockpit, the windscreen in the front of the cockpit, and that's great engineering because you don't have to deal with a frameless clear piece. So that's wonderful, and it fits really, really good. Same thing with this piece right here, where the exhaust stacks come out. That's a separate piece on both sides. This piece right here, where the carburetor vents are, is a separate piece on each side. And then you've got this piece on the front that makes the mouth of the intake. And then you've got this piece up here that makes the mouth of the carburetor scoop. And then you've got this thing right here, which as far as I can tell is, that little thing right there, is a cover for the lid to the oil tank. So what's the issue? Well, the problem is that all of these pieces fit really good, like almost to the point of having no gap. And that's a problem because every one of them joins along a panel line. And there is literally nothing that I hate more than having to create a panel line around the edge of a part that's been glued in and has basically no gap. There's only one company that I've seen that's really able to pull that off, and it's Tamiya, of course. They just do a better job of it. Hasegawa has done a great job of making these parts fit, but what happens is, like on this one in particular, you have no gap, and so there's no panel line there. And I want all of these panel lines to be uniform. So that means going back and rescribing it. In a few cases, I had to repunch some of these Zeus fasteners, but really it was mostly just scribing. And so you can see this has been a continuous process of scribing, spot priming, fixing mistakes, scribing, sanding, spot priming. I think I'm on about my 5th or 6th round of it with all of this, because you just really have to have some primer on there to see what you've done effectively. But the process that I use is, the first thing I want to do is get all the low-hanging fruit. The panel lines that were already there, they weren't necessarily uniform, so I deepened those by using this. And this is my favorite scriber. This is the one made by Martin Schneider at MRP. He makes 3 of them. This one, he makes this one, and then he makes an even skinnier version of this one. So what I do is I go in there and make sure it's deep enough. Then I widen it a little bit with this one. This is Paul Budzik's scriber of choice, because he's a dentist, so he likes this thing. And it makes it, it widens it as much as you need it to because of the way the tip is shaped. It's a kind of an oval almost with a point on it. Anyway, so once I've got the existing ones wide and deep enough to satisfy me, then I turn to the ones that have to be created next to the inserts. So like on both sides of this panel right here. So the first thing that I do is I use this. This is my go-to instrument for that, is this little Tamiya. This is out of their 0.15 millimeter fine razor saw set. You can see it's a photo etch thing, and you just put it in a cheapo X-Acto handle. And this particular one that looks like a little cheese knife is great because of that round tip. It lets you work with a lot of control, and that's the challenge with with scribing a line like this, where there was no gap to start with. You may have just a little bit of a guide because, like you can see, maybe how one panel is a little higher than the other. So that gives you a little bit of a ridge to run up against, but you may not have a full length sort of track to run your tool along. And so what this curved blade enables you to do is work it. So you start where you know you've got a positive guide, and you just start ooching your way along and lengthening the segment as much as possible without jumping off track until you get to the end of it. And that typically works pretty good. If it's serious though, then I have to use guide tape, and for that my go-to is this high Q scribing tape. Like it a lot. It just works, and it's easier to get than Dymo. Dymo is really stiff, and the adhesive is really aggressive. I've had it rip paint and primer clean off of a model, so I prefer the high Q. Anyhow, once I get it worked with the saw blade to where I've got a consistent line, then I come back and do the same steps with the scribers to get it where it matches the other ones. Now, in the case where I need to repunch a rivet, then I use a beading tool for that. And this thing is great. If you don't have one of these, this is really a case of you're doing it wrong. Yeah, you can repunch the little circle that represents a Zeus fastener with something like a piece of brass tubing or a hypodermic needle, but you got to get the right size, and you got to cut it. You got to just do a bunch of gyrations. So if you're just a lazy bitch like me, this is the way to go, because you've got so many sizes and they're graduated so closely that you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to find one that matches the feature on the surface already. So that's kind of the process. Now, yeah, there's going to be mistakes. And there's going to be, it's just not going to be perfect. I mean, no matter how steady you are, no matter how good your eye-hand coordination is, there's going to be mistakes. You're going to scribe outside the lines. So then the question is, well, how do you fix those? And you can see a good example of that right there at the corner of that vent panel. You can see I jumped out there and scratched it. So you got to fill that in. Well, I've got probably a dozen of those little things all over this nose. And what I do to fix those, and really any super shallow scratch, is don't panic and reach for the sprue goo or the super glue, or definitely not the putty or whatever, because those are really not appropriate. You need something that's going to stay in a really shallow scratch like that one right there. And sprue goo is fine for that, because it's going to bond to the plastic and it'll stay in a scratch. But the other materials, they can flake out of something that's really, really shallow. And even sprue goo, if it's really, really thin, like let's say that you've just got a little bit of a divot, like a ghost seam, for example, it's not deep enough to really hold the traditional filler materials. So what you want is something that's really light and relatively thin compared to putty that will bond to the plastic. And the material that I find for that that's perfect is this goopy old ALC 309, that's all clad, microfiller primer. It's a lacquer primer, and it's really hot. I mean, it sinks into the plastic like nothing else I've found. It's so hot that it screws up the lid of this Tamiya jar that formerly contained extra thin, which is just basically acetone and butyl acetate. I mean, if that's not hot, then I don't know what is. This stuff is hot enough to affect that green plastic. But you can see it's pretty goopy. And so it's a good lightweight filler, and it's got that same sort of sandability that lacquer is famous for, but it's even a little bit tougher than that. It's almost as hard as black super glue, which I've been using a lot. I've got to get a new jar for this. This top has gotten completely munged up, and I can't even really screw it on there, which is going to make me unhappy because having the little brush in there is the greatest thing. Anyway, I'll deal with that later. I've been using this black super glue a lot. This stuff is really fantastic. It has it's brought me back from my hatred of super glue, because this, I guess because it's rubberized, whatever they do to it, it's a little softer and easier sanding, so you don't get that differential hardness that you do with regular super glue. But I still don't use this for light scratches. I use this goopy old primer, and it works good because I can wet sand it right back down. And then, you use your primer as a guide coat. So you can sand that off, you can see where your scratches are, you fill it in with this stuff, get it all smoothed down, hit it with spot primer again, sand it a little bit, make sure you're all good, nothing's showing, and that's how I go around dealing with all those mistakes. So that's where I'm at with this. I think this is done, finally, and about ready to join to the wings. So that'll be the next phase of that project. The next thing, the other thing that I've been spending a lot of time on is this bust that I showed you guys last time around. This thing has been fun, a little frustrating, because trying to keep these nice black and white color separations has been hard, but it's coming out okay, I guess. The main things that I've done since I showed this to you on the last one is I did this pink on the blanket here, which was kind of a lot of fun, kind of a lot of work as well. What I did is I just used mission models. They're what I call normal acrylics, and I did it all with brushwork because even though I really prefer to use oils for blending and shading, I'm still trying to develop my skills in doing all of that with acrylics. And so I push myself on each figure project to do some portion of it using acrylics. And mission models behaves pretty much like Vallejo or any of the other popular figure painting acrylics when you reduce it with water. If you reduce it with their own thinner, it has a tendency to reactivate itself, which you definitely don't want when you're trying to do blending. So I just use a wet palette and blend it with water, and it works fine. And I got most of the way there with this, but it still didn't have the pop that I wanted. It wasn't terrible, but I wasn't super happy with it. So I ordered myself some Magenta Ink. You guys know I've been messing with inks a lot, and I love these. And what I did with this is, again, I reduced this stuff with water. I just use it on a wet palette. And I did a lot of blending work in the shadows to give them that kind of deep magenta tone. I did a little bit with magic wash to call out this piping along the edge there, and that turned out pretty good, but it still wasn't quite where I wanted. So I came along with a really thin mix, about 10-to-1 alcohol and ink in the airbrush, and then just did some directional spraying to get deeper shadows, and then came back, mixed it with some white to get a little bit more of a highlight there on top. And I'm really stoked about the way the blanket turned out. It's got a lot of depth to it, and the color really pops, so that's good. I also told you guys on the last one that I was going to go through and use the method in Kirill Kaniev's figure FAQ book to do the eyes. And I've done that, and I think they turned out okay. The basic process there was that you paint the white part, then and this is my own step. He doesn't specify this because he's cool enough he doesn't need to. I use something that's erasable to mark the center of the pupils, and then you paint a dark colored circle that represents the size of the complete iris. And that gives you, that sets you up for that dark rim around the iris. And then come back in, paint the iris itself, whatever color. And one of his magic things is he paints the lower portion of it a lighter tone to make it look like it's translucent and is, that kind of getting light bleeding into it. And then, of course, the last thing you do is come in and paint the pupil itself. Now, another thing that I do is that I separate the layers. with a clear coat, because that allows me to basically do, it's like a save as button. It basically allows me to preserve the work that I've done successfully so far and not worry about screwing that up with whatever I'm about to do next. And specifically, one of the things that's really enabled me to make this look better than it otherwise might is the 409 trick. And the fact is, this is a magic bottle right here. 409, if you're not familiar, is a household cleaning product that was invented back in the 60s. I've used it for decades as a basic shop cleaner and degreaser, even though it's really sold as a household cleaner. And I love it. And I just discovered by accident one day that it will remove some acrylics, not all of them. Like Stynylrez, for example, doesn't even touch it, does nothing. But Mission models, and especially these acrylic inks, you can remove them pronto with 409. And especially like if you're doing the magic wash where you've mixed it with aqua gloss or something, works there as well. But when I'm just doing the straight ink thinned with water, this is really great because I can put it on a little bitty brush, and basically I'm using it the same way that I would use mineral spirits on oils, to go back and cut in around things like a pupil that I've painted and maybe not done such a good job of getting it round. So it's basically a magic eraser for every time you color outside the lines. And come on, focus up there. And you can see these are not perfect, but I guarantee you they're a whole lot more perfect than they were when I actually painted them on there. Whatever degree of good they are now is because I was able to go back in and cut in with the 409 and fix my mistakes. Now, I know this is frustrating for you guys who live outside the United States, because I've had a lot of people ask me, is there an equivalent product overseas? Because as far as I know, 409 is only sold in the United States, and apparently it's even hard to get right now because COVID and all that. But the truth is, I don't know, guys. The active ingredient in 409 is about 0.5% of ammonium chloride. And ammonia is a solvent for the emulsions that are in acrylic paints. And I think that that's probably part of why it works. It's why, ammonia, the Windex with ammonia in it works good as an airbrush cleaner, even though there are people who gasp in horror at that. I mean, the guys at Badger have recommended that you can clean your airbrush with straight ammonia if you really want to. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on that, but point being is that little bit of ammonia may be what does it. So point being is you might look for household cleaners that have an ammonia as the active ingredient and just experiment with your acrylics and see if it works. So anyway, the other thing I've been working on is the hair. I'm getting set up to do basically the white highlights. I've been working on the shadows and the midtones. The Kirill Koniev book didn't really help me a whole lot. And I looked around on YouTube, didn't really find a lot of resources for how to do hair. So I'm kind of just working on my own on this. And this has been a lot of painting and erasing and working it. And now I've got all this sealed in. And I went and got myself some brushes that I hope will help me even more. Got myself a couple of new Series 7s, and these are the traditional ones. A lot of you may not realize that there's two kinds of Winsor & Newton Series 7. This is the traditional one, and it's got a fairly long pointed tip. You can see that's a number 1, and then you compare that to the Series 7 Miniature. See, this is a number 0. Look how short and pointy that tip is, which is great for working with oils. And actually, as it turns out, these acrylic inks behave the same way because you're really only putting a little tiny bit of paint on the very tip. So you don't need a belly to hold the acrylic the way that a lot of the acrylic figure painters want. So that's what that longer brush tip gives you. So anyway, that's what's happening this weekend. I'm going to try and finish off the hair and hope that it turns out good. And then she will basically be done. Another one of my figure misadventures in the books. Anyway, that's enough. See ya. Okay, yeah, you knew we weren't done, right? Yeah, I cannot not mention this. Check this out. This is a super cool fish from France, handmade by an artist who is friends of my buddy Fanch, with a wonderful little note here. And I just got to give Fanch a shout out because he's like a brother from another mother. If you guys aren't familiar with who I'm talking about Fancharello Models. He of the Amaze Balls CAD and Blender or ZBrush work that he's been doing lately, and lots of 3D printing. He's just an amazing modeler and an artist and an all-around awesome guy. Thanks, Fanch. I really appreciate this. This came at a time when things were a little rough around here, and I really appreciated the thought, man. Thank you.